This podcast is for educational and entertainment purposes only. Nothing stated on it, either by its hosts or any guests, is to be construed as psychological, medical, or legal advice. You are listening to Adoptees On, the podcast where adoptees discuss the adoption experience. I'm Haley Radke. Today's guest is Sanjay Pulver, an Indian adoptee who has become an outspoken adoptee advocate in recent years. We talk about the complexities of being adopted from an orphanage in a country that is not currently safe for him to return to as a queer trans man. We discuss the intersections between being transnationally and transracially adopted with being a trans person, and Sanjay also shares about his experience with somatic therapy. Before we get started, I want to personally invite you to join our Patreon adoptee community today over on adopteeson.com/community, which helps support you and also the show to support more adoptees around the world. We wrap up with some recommended resources, and as always, links to everything we'll be talking about today are on the website, adopteeson.com. Let's listen in. I'm so pleased to welcome to Adoptees On, Sanjay Pulver. Welcome, Sanjay. How are you?
I'm doing really well. Thank you so much for having me on.
I remember the first time we were in a Zoom room together, which was a couple of years ago. But today I'd love it if you would start with sharing some of your story with us.
I am originally from a very small village in South India, somewhere outside of Hyderabad. And at 3 weeks old, I was relinquished to an orphanage in the area and was there for about 9 to 10-ish months, and then was placed with an unofficial foster family for about a month or so. And then at 13 months old, I was flown over to the US and placed with my adopters. And I flew into Los Angeles International Airport, but my adopters live in San Diego. So we just drove down from there, and I've been here pretty much ever since. The parts of India where I'm from, like I said, very small village. From my understanding, my birth family was part of the lowest caste in India, usually referred to or previously referred to as the untouchables. Now they're called Dalits, so that's DALIT is the nomenclature now. And as far as I know, I have 4 older sisters, 1 older brother, and a fraternal twin brother who I only knew or found out about when I was 11. And the orphanage I was part of, I found out in around 2020, was actually part of a giant international adoption trafficking scandal. But within my adoptive family, I'm an only child. I'm also a transracial adoptee. And it was kind of a lonely experience because being raised in a family where I was the only non-white person my age, it felt pretty isolating at times. And then, of course, realizing later in my life that there were more aspects of my identity that I was unaware of and started having, thoughts about, and I'm going to use the phrase coming into consciousness about, really threw a lot of that into chaos, and realizing how my identity as a transgender man and being adoptee are inherently linked to each other. So a lot of that is kind of how I started coming into consciousness, or, as we sometimes say, out of the fog, put that in quotes, is really where I started coming into the advocacy part of my journey, and now talking about how all of the intersections that I have really shape how I navigate the world, and the conversations I have within it.
So you're in your early 30s now, right?
Yep, just turned 31 in November.
Okay. I'm just trying to drag you along a little further. Early 30s, like could be anywhere in there. Um, and you said that you didn't find out that you had a fraternal twin until you were 11. Who did you find out information from that you had older siblings, where you were born, your orphanage, all of those things? Did you get that information disclosed to you, or did you have to look for it?
My adoptive grandma had made a scrapbook for me when I was really little, and it had photos of the orphanage and I think photocopies of the very sparse paperwork that I had. And this was information not compiled by my adopters. There was another couple who actually went to India to the same orphanage to go get their child. And while they were there, took tons of photos, took video, and then sent it to my adopters. So my adopters didn't go to India to get me. They decided to have me delivered instead. They wanted expedited shipping, but that actually ended up getting delayed.
Oh my God.
Yeah. They tried real hard, but didn't happen. So the paperwork that I have is sort of like the patient intake form for the orphanage. And on it, it said information about family. And it just says family is poor, mother is weak. They have 4 daughters, 2 sons. This child is born a twin. Couldn't save both, so wanted to give one up to adoption. And the way I found out about my twin, even though it was written on that paperwork, I was at an endocrinology appointment with my adoptive mother. And this was because, as somebody who was assigned female at birth, my adoptive mom wanted to make sure that hormonally there was nothing going wrong that would impact my menstrual cycle. And so we were there, and as she was giving the doctor my family medical history, she was saying that, oh, she's a twin, she has siblings, all these things. And I kind of sat there for a minute with my jaw dropped, like, wait, run that by me again. What? And that, I think that was the first time I had heard those words come out of somebody's mouth rather than kind of skimming over them and reading them. And I was at an age where I could actually consciously process what I had heard. And so, yeah, I found out at a doctor's appointment. And I actually didn't know the sex of my twin at that point. I only found out in 2020.
So, okay, I'm sorry that is how you found out. And also, I guess, do you know anything further besides just what was in that paperwork or what she said? To me, I read that or heard you read that off to us, recall that to us. And I thought, oh my goodness, did the twin die and they didn't want you to, you know what I mean? It sounded like there was some peril there.
So India in the 1990s was very similarly had a similar attitude rather towards girls than boys and wanting sons over daughters, very similar to China's, one child policy, in sentiment, just not legislated into existence. And my birth family, as far as I know, had 4 daughters and 1 son. And then my twin brother and I were born. So it was yay, we finally have our 2nd son. And then, oh my God, we have a 5th daughter. Get rid of her. That is a part of my story that I have kind of always known and have been told since I was very young of yeah, you were probably given up because you were a girl. That was kind of a reality that I've lived with for a while. And I say it so matter of factly, and people are very shocked by that, I think. And I'm like, it's like saying what I had for breakfast. It's just, yeah, this is my life. Okay, next thing. But I think also the fact that when I was trying to follow up with my adoptive mother, like as we were walking to the car, I was sobbing and crying and very, very upset, being like, why didn't you tell me? And the answer I was told was, oh, well, we did tell you when you were younger, but you were probably watching TV, so you didn't hear us. And even if you did hear us, you were too young to understand what we were saying. And that was the end of the conversation.
Okay. Sure. Oh my goodness. Oh dear. Yeah. So I've heard you talk about this a little bit, but maybe you'll weave this in as you kind of share more of this part of your story. But if you had grown up in India, obviously, stating the obvious here, you would have had a very different life.
Yes.
And what does that mean to you to be living in the United States, having been able to make some choices that you wouldn't have likely been able to had you grown up where your biological family still is, I'm assuming? I don't know. Yeah, you're shrugging. I don't know exactly. We don't know. Can you talk a little bit about that and maybe more about your coming into your identity?
I would say that I fall very solidly into the stereotypical tomboy to butch queer woman to trans guy sort of pipeline. I know that's not everybody's experience, but that was mine. Absolutely. Just short of playing softball, I was a band kid instead.
Wait, what did you play?
I'm a French horn player.
Okay.
Been playing for 20 years.
Wow.
So I'm very proud of that. And funny enough, I was actually the only girl in my entire fifth grade class to play trumpet. So I was just, I was one of the guys from a very young age. And I think I never grew out of that.
Okay.
If anything, I grew into that more than out of it, I guess you could say.
Mm-hmm.
But I think the biggest difference is the access to gender affirming care is the biggest one. As far as differences in being raised in the US versus being raised in India, I think a big one too is just how long would I have actually survived? I know it's kind of a morbid and macabre thing to think about, but I've kind of told people since I was, young that, yeah, I probably wouldn't be alive had I stayed in India because I was very, very small when I was born. I mean, even by Indian standards, I was small. And at 31, I'm 4'10" and a half. So I'm like, look, if Indian people were saying I was small when I was born, like I was small. Like there was no way of winning that. And so kind of like saying I was relinquished for being assigned female at birth, saying that, yeah, I probably wouldn't have survived had I stayed in India is just kind of one of those unpleasant but objective facts that I share as part of my story. And the other side of being trans, and if I were to go try and search for family now, aside from the fact I have no information, so I really have nothing to go on, there is a major risk as a trans and queer person traveling to India right now. So it's literally not safe for me to go, even if I wanted to. And if I did go, I would basically have to, I'd say, be stealth. So being stealth is just not being open about either your sexuality or your gender identity, is a term that's used in the community pretty frequently. And having been on testosterone a little bit over 9 years now, I'm going to use it in quotes, but I pass pretty well. passing is not necessarily the goal or really should be considered the standard for any trans person. You know, if you want to pass, great. If you don't, great. There's no right way to be trans, just like there's no one right way to be an adoptee. You know, we're all individual. We all have our own different stories, paths, and all of them are valid. So I do want to make that parallel as well. But, you know, I run into the issue of if I were to find my family, like what would I say? Like, hi, I was your daughter. I came back with a beard. Hi. Like, how, you know, how do you navigate something like that? Or in a way, I almost need to use the very, very small amount of masculine privilege that I have, which is not a lot. I will definitely say that it is not a lot. I still experience misogyny on a fairly frequent basis. And just because I have a beard and a slightly deeper voice does not mean that people have stopped treating me as though I was still feminine. But, you know, I've thought about if I were to go search, I would basically take all of my paperwork that has my birth name, all of my stuff, and just say, yes, my name is Sanjay, but I am searching on behalf of my sister. Because they'll probably want to talk to a guy about this more than they would want to talk to a woman about this. And whatever information they give me is my information, but I'm asking for it in such a way that I'm not, hopefully, not putting myself in unnecessary risk.
Oh my goodness, the complexity, like all the added layers you have in your experience. And from what I understand, it's very difficult to search in India anyway. DNA testing and things is kind of like, I don't know. We're recording in 2024. Maybe it's different in the future, but you can't take kits out, I think. I think I saw you post something about that.
So the current laws around at least DNA testing in India, from my understanding, is that you can't take genetic material out of the country. So, for example, if I were living in India and I wanted to take a 23andMe test, I could order the test, take the test. I could just not ship. I would not be allowed to ship it back out to be processed. And that is the biggest reason why both Ancestry and 23andMe do not ship to India. And therefore, all of the demographic data those companies have come from expats and adoptees.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And there are DNA companies within India that do testing, but they only say, here's where you're from in India. They don't do family matching because that still is a very taboo subject, you know, talking about having children out of wedlock, especially when you get into caste politics, which I do not have a thorough enough understanding to be able to fully explain that.
Well, when you mentioned that, I was like, oh yeah, I have heard from fellow Indian adoptees that they sometimes will match with other adoptees in the States, which, you know, great that you have a connection, but you're still sort of at a loss for the other information. Yeah, that's complicated. Okay. There's so many things I want to ask you about. I don't know where to go first. I think I want to circle back to the orphanage tracking. I'm thinking about DNA too much. The orphanage trafficking situation, because again, in your story, there's this complexity where, you know, people often will say to adoptees, oh, well, do you wish you had languished in an orphanage? And that is a part of your story. You were in an orphanage. Like, so can you talk a little bit about that? And how did you find out that your orphanage was caught up in this scandal?
In 2020, I was funny enough, I was on Reddit and I posted in the Adoptee Reddit page community saying, I'm an Indian adoptee. This is all the information I have. I'm making one last ditch effort to figure out if there's any other information I can get. Anybody got anything for me? And somebody said, you should contact this particular person who's sort of the main point person doing searches in India, who's also an Indian adoptee who was adopted to Germany. And so I got in contact with this person and we set up a Zoom call. And when I was mentioning, oh, I'm from the Action for Social Development orphanage, he was like, wait, you came out of ASD? And I said, yes. And he's like, I've never known anybody to come out of there from that scandal. And I was like, what scandal? And basically in 1999, so I had already been in the States for 6 years at that point. But in 1999, the orphanage got raided and it was shown and proven, and the executive director was arrested and confessed to illegally purchasing children and sending them to the US to make money off the adoptions. And even went to lengths to forge relinquishment documents, to file guardianship certificates, basically falsely, like under false pretenses. And how that connects into my story is that in May of 2020, before I had this Zoom call, my adopters were cleaning out a filing cabinet, and my adoptive dad was like, here's a file about your adoption if you want it. And I was like, oh, okay. And I opened it up and it was all information and files that I had never seen before in my life. And it also included this guardianship certificate, which I did not know existed. And essentially what that said was my adoptive father was named my legal guardian, and it gave him the legal right to take me out of India and adopt me according to the laws of whatever country he lived in, this case being the US. So on the US side, I am completely legally adopted all above board. I have not actually been formally adopted in the eyes of Indian law. So I'm only half adopted, technically. But to your point about the orphanage, being in like a tiny crib on my back, pretty much the only times I would be picked up is maybe if I was being fed, maybe not, I don't know. I actually had a lot of developmental delays physically because I wasn't hitting all of those, crawling, rolling over, toddling milestones. And I didn't realize that structurally my body sort of compensated for that over the years unknowingly, which is why actually last year I started seeing a somatic therapist who also specializes in trauma and in developmental stuff as well. So interestingly, I'm hitting developmental milestones in my late 20s, early 30s that babies do in like the first few months of their lives, which is interesting and fascinating. And also, I never thought I'd be looking at a baby rolling over and going, I'm jealous of you. Like, you're a baby. Why should I be envious of you? Like, you haven't done anything. But I'm like, wow, here I am being jealous of babies. Who knew? But, institutional orphanage care did mess me up in a lot of ways. And I know that because in the criminal complaint and everything, the documents were forged, that really gives me a lot of hesitation around whether or not, if something were to happen where we're going into a new election cycle, knock on wood, this does not happen, but at least for the US, if trans people continue to be attacked and attempts to eradicate us continue, as an immigrant, I'm really here at the government's pleasure and the government's behest. And so I don't really know what I'm going to do if for some reason, like I get in trouble or something and I get deported because India has no records on me, really. At least not currently, because everything, again, is in my birth name and none of it has been updated gender wise. And I found out I'd have to pay like $600 to change my name and my gender on my certificate of citizenship, which is the only document I haven't updated because I didn't know you could update that. But I also worry, or I was worried as well, because funny enough, when I did change my name and gender legally in 2016, going to the Social Security office to update everything, they asked me, do you have proof of citizenship? And I said, what, like a passport? And they said, yeah. And I said, oh, I do. It's just at home. And they said, oh, well, it looks like when you got naturalized in 1994, nobody updated Social Security and told us. So I was a legal alien according to Social Security for 20 some odd years, and I had no idea. I mean, now it says I'm a citizen, but it's funny that had I not transitioned, that little hiccup and falling through the cracks within like bureaucracy, that could have come back to bite me in a really bad way. And the only reason I found out is because I transitioned. So that's kind of where I'm at with it.
It's really mind-boggling to me that in 2024, adoptee citizenship is still such a critical issue, you know? And I mean, adoptive parents really need to stand up and take responsibility for this issue. And because there's so many deported adoptees who they have no power in the United States to make change and call for reform. They're not here anymore. And
right.
So, yeah, I know that's kind of an aside, but I'm really disappointed with adoptive parents who don't take responsibility for that. Whew. Yeah.
Yeah, I'm right there with you.
We have so much complexity in your story, and I'm going to ask you a question where I don't think these things are able to be separated. So coming into your identity as an adopted person, unpacking the complexities of that, coming out of the fog, coming into consciousness, all of those things. And then also coming into your true gender identity. I mean, can you talk about those things? You've said before they're intertwined for you. Were you processing them at the same time? What was that like for you? Can you share a little bit more about that?
I wasn't processing my gender stuff and my adoptee stuff at the same time. I think my adoptee identity had been pretty solid as far as growing up. I was like, I knew I was adopted. I had a fairly consistent narrative from my understanding. Although on the outside looking in, it seemed like I had a pretty cushy setup and life. There were a lot of cracks in the stereotypical narratives that, we have around adoption. I saw those from a very young age, but I never really had the language to describe what felt off about it. And around, I'd say, like 10 years old, I started realizing that as far as like my sexuality, my sexual orientation, I knew there was something slightly different about that. So I think that's kind of when I started questioning that. And I'd already been a tomboy for, since I was really little. And then in middle school, middle school is just chaotic for everybody, regardless of your identities. It's just a bad time usually for everybody because you're going through social changes, you have hormones running amok. Like it's just, I wouldn't wish repeating middle school on anybody. And I will also say, especially going through a puberty that you don't want, that's also a trip and a half because technically, being on testosterone, I had to go through puberty again. So it's puberty 2.0. And so there were moments where I asked one of my friends, I was like, well, if everything about me was the same, but I was a boy, would you date me? And if that wasn't a big sign, I don't know what is, but that just went right over my head. I didn't think anything of it at the time. But as I've continued on my journey as an adoptee, what I started realizing was that at the very beginning of my transition, I was talking to another trans person and I had said, oh, I want to get a tattoo of my name Sanjay and my birth name in Telugu, which is the language I would have heard growing up had I stayed in India. And I wanted to get them sort of like in a band around my arm to sort of symbolize that even though these are two different names, like they are still me and like it is connected. And this other trans person told me, oh, I guess you're not really trans. And I was like, what do you mean by that? And she's like, oh, well, the fact that you're not rejecting every single part of yourself that's feminine, you're not really trans. And that was just a really crappy thing to say in general, but also hearing it from another trans person also added another level of hurt to that. But then what I realized was to reject my identity prior to my transition was actually mirroring the invalidation of my experiences prior to my adoption. Because growing up, it was always like, well, you're in the US now. Everything's fine now. You don't need to think about your life in India. Like India bad, US good. Like that's very reductive and very simplified. But that is what it boiled down to. And it feels disingenuous for me to not acknowledge that I had 22 years, 21 and a half years of life experiences that have shaped me. Like it just feels disingenuous to ignore all of that and just pretend like none of it happened, because I say this a lot, but living as a woman has made me a better man. And it's allowed me to navigate situations that I think a lot of cis men don't have the tools for and have not been raised to have emotional intimacy with other people. Like a lot of parts of that, the like of patriarchy and toxic masculinity, those are not things that I was raised with. So I have sort of a more objective view of it, so I can see it, but I can also then say, hey, you can still be a man and not ascribe to those things. And I also realized that my relinquishment and my adoption are both based on the assumptions about who I was because of my assigned gender at birth. Like I was relinquished because we had another girl, we don't want you. And then my adopters were in their applications were like, we are writing this specifically because we want a daughter from India. And they did. They had a daughter from India for about 21 and a half years. And now they have a son for the rest of their lives. Mm. So those things are always going to be entwined for me. And I will also say a small caveat that while obviously nobody is ever prepared to have a trans child or a gender nonconforming child, that's not something anybody can prepare for. And while I don't believe that either set of guardians and parents that I've had over the course of my life are inherently transphobic as people, the decisions that were made based on my assigned gender and the worth and value that were ascribed to those and those decisions, those were absolutely transphobic. And granted, like, this is just my own perspective on it. It's not necessarily going to be how other trans adoptees feel about it, but the people might not have been transphobic, but their actions absolutely were.
I appreciate you sharing that. And I know you've done a lot of speaking and panels about your experience as a trans person with, of course, your adoptee identity, a transracial and transnationally adopted person. And this is the tricky part of being what I see as being a member of the queer community who's often looked at adoption as a tool for family building. Can you speak into that as, you know, you've got your foot in different worlds that do intersect, but as someone who has spoken out for family preservation and abolition of both the family policing system and the adoption industrial complex, those things, the queer community often is still using adoption as a family building tool.
I think the biggest thing that I would like to see is more honest and open conversations and more transparency around family building for queer folks, because I know you had other guests on here who've really talked about the history of adoption and the link to queer community before. So I'm not necessarily going to rehash all of that. I know which episode folks should go listen to if they want to get that history lesson.
Okay,
Dr. Sandra Steingraber. Yep, that's the one I was. Yep,
Dr. Sandra Steingraber. Okay, let me look it up for folks so they can.
I think just recognizing that we are not poster children for, I guess, being able to adopt children as queer people. We shouldn't be seen as like the gold standard of this is how you are a successful queer person. Like, this is how you get it made, right? Like, there's so many other ways to be in community, to have family, chosen family, found family, that don't involve supporting harmful and oppressive systems. And I think the biggest thing is just being honest with the kids and making sure that they have access to the resources, namely therapy, and also any information about their biological parents or their sperm donor or their surrogate or, the egg donor, like whoever was involved in the creation of this child, being able to access that information so that as things come up and kids are growing and they have questions, those conversations can happen honestly and in age appropriate ways. And then once the kids are old enough, and if they have a desire to seek out these people, the ability to do so is there, and it's not behind red tape, and there's no gatekeeping for that. And interestingly, touching a little bit on genetics, it's very interesting being a trans adoptee in trans spaces, because so much of the conversations regarding early transition and medical transition focus a lot on DNA and, people going, well, what's my beard going to look like? Am I going to go bald? Or, how much is my chest going to grow if I'm on estrogen, and like these sorts of things. And a lot of the default answers are like, oh, well, just go look at pictures of your family, go look at this, or, and I have to sit there and kind of keep my mouth shut because frankly, it's triggering and activating every single time somebody asks that question, which is pretty much always because new folks are going to be asking all the time. And I, at least personally for me, don't feel like it's appropriate to be in those spaces and ask, hey, can you put a content warning or a trigger warning on talking about genetics or talking about family or talking about relationship to parents or like genetic mirroring? Because most often I'm the only one in those spaces, or if I'm not, I'm the only one who is not in reunion or and has no information or photos or anything. So I just keep it to myself. And I usually joke and say, I just look in the mirror, cross my fingers, and hope for the best.
Mm.
So it can be very difficult at times to hold space for both when you know that you can't necessarily access the answers you want, which also begs the question too of, is my twin trans? Like that's a question I think about sometimes. And we are fraternal twins, but if we both transitioned, did we just become fraternal twins in the opposite direction? Or if my twin isn't trans and I did, and I did transition, now do we look more identical? Like, do we look like identical twins now? Like, those are questions I think about that I know I'm probably not going to get an answer for.
Oh my goodness. So many things. Thank you for sharing. I know we're going to do recommended resources. I just want to ask you one more thing if you're open to it. You mentioned
Sure.
Trying out somatic therapy. Mm-hmm. And is there anything you want to say about that? Like for other adoptees who may have had some similar circumstances, maybe being a prolonged time in orphanage, as you were mentioning about not being attended to your physical needs, anything like that to encourage folks if they want to try that out?
So I'm very fortunate in that my somatic therapist is also a trauma therapist and specifically works from an attachment lens. Like I hit the trifecta, and somatic therapy can look a lot of different ways. So I do talk therapy with my regular therapist. I do EMDR, which personally has been a literal life-changing experience for me. It's been amazing. And then doing somatic therapy for basically all the body work stuff that EMDR and talk therapy can't necessarily help process. And a lot of it is body work of just like being on the table and kind of getting like sort of like deep tissue massage, and but also there's a lot of like actual restructuring of my physical being, of like moving muscles and realizing like, oh, I never learned really how to hold my head up correctly because my lat muscles in my back never really activated. So I'm using my neck and my shoulders to hold my head up. And that's why I have so much tension in my shoulders and my neck, and like learning that, oh, I didn't really have a lot of core strength as a baby. So learning how to like stabilize my core, or even learning how to stand, because that was the biggest surprise I had, because I used to stand with my legs pretty far apart, so I almost looked like a triangle, because a triangle is a strong shape. The first time I stood with my legs pretty much like in a normal stance close together, my knees went wobbly because they didn't know how to hold, like, I almost didn't know how to hold my own weight standing without my legs being super far apart. But I've physically have changed everything about body mechanics and how I move to finally compensate for that time in the orphanage. But I will also say the most recent appointment that I had with my somatic therapist, we didn't do any body work, but for the majority of it, I was sitting and holding my somatic therapist's 6-week-old baby. And it's funny because the baby and we actually share a birthday, which is a total coincidence, but that created a bond and a connection because now here is a baby with my birthday who is hitting all of these developmental milestones. And I get to see a parallel process between when that baby was 3 weeks old, this is what was going on. When I was 3 weeks old, I was already relinquished, and like seeing that very clearly was really profound. And then just being able to hold a baby that was that small. And I'm like, I was this small once. And I mean, the baby just slept through everything and was snoring. And there I was just like sobbing and having a big, giant emotional moment. And the baby was just totally unaware of everything, which I feel like kind of encapsulates that experience pretty well. So, I think somatic therapy can incorporate lots of different elements depending on your own situation and your own needs and what you're hoping to get out of it. And not all of it will be lying on a table and getting massaged or getting body work. Sometimes it's holding a baby and crying.
Beautiful. What an amazing experience. I'm glad you were able to do that. Okay, let's talk about our recommended resources. So I'm just going to quickly mention the episode we were sort of referring to was episode 240 with Dr. Sandra Steingraber. And I want to recommend another podcast today that it's only 4 episodes, but for people who are in the abolitionist mindset, it is with Dorothy Roberts, and she has a 4-part series called Torn Apart, which is based on her fabulous book, Torn Apart, but talking about the family policing system. And she talks with people who are adopted, fostered, parents who have been visited by CPS, all of those things. It's really an incredible resource. And for folks who the book is like kind of dense and you haven't gotten there yet, this is a great primer into Dorothy Roberts' work. So I will make sure to link to that. And then I mentioned earlier that you have been a guest on several panels for adoptees, speaking about different things. 2 with Adoption Mosaic, 1 where you're talking about your twin experience, if people want to hear more about that. And then I also really enjoyed listening to you on the Adoptees United panel, the Rainbow Adoptees, Intersection of Queerness and Adoption. And so if folks want to hear more from you, those are a couple of great places where they can hear your advocacy work. And I'm going to link to those in the show notes as well. What did you want to recommend to us today?
I think you've already mentioned it before, but the podcast Rescripting the Narrative, which is hosted by a previous guest, Lena Venegas and Solyaku, is a great podcast. I think they have 1 or 2 episodes out currently, but it is a podcast really talking about making adoption narratives more adoptee-centered, talking about the connections to imperialism, colonialism, an extension of, white supremacy culture, and really deconstructing the adoption industry and how we can reform it, abolish it as far as like plenary adoption is concerned. And that's even just those 2 episodes are fabulous. And the other resource I wanted to mention as well is the Adult Adoptee UK movement. And that was actually started by the host of the Zoom call where we met, as it turns out. And while a lot of their advocacy is UK based, their website and their blog posts are open to like all adoptees to share their experiences. And I think a lot of folks can find good writing there and things that resonate with them. And I think they do some meetups and things like that. And I think they are going to try and expand. And I think they might also be working with Adoptees United executive director Greg Luce on a couple of things. So I want to plug that, because if it hadn't been for that Zoom call and that group of folks, I wouldn't actually be sitting here having a conversation with you. So
I don't know. Do you think?
I mean, I don't know.
We've connected in other ways, but yes,
I feel like we would have eventually, but
Yes, I'm so appreciative of Vic and their work, and we will link to adultadoptee.org.uk in the show notes as well, so folks can find that. And they have been doing a lot of forward momentum has been happening there with the government, and lots of things in the last couple of years. Thank you so much for sharing part of your story with us and talking about some things that, a lot of people don't really know much about. I really appreciate that. Where can folks connect with you online and hear more from you?
As far as adoptee stuff goes, my Instagram, which is just my name, so it's just at Sanjay.Pulver on Instagram. That is the only social media that my adopters don't have any presence on, either one of them. So that's kind of the main place where I feel the most safe to just post candidly about my experiences, I guess we'll say. I do use Twitter occasionally if I really feel like I want to post something for folks I know through that platform, which again is just, it's at Pulver Sanjay with first and last name capitalized. Those are kind of the main social medias that I use for adoptee related stuff. And yeah, I just really am appreciative of you letting me come and sort of run my mouth for about an hour. And
well, Sanjay, you're someone that I have linked other trans adoptee folks to, because I know you're a safe person for them to go to, and you have open doors for them to go to other support group spaces and things. So I really appreciate having you as a resource for me when I don't know the right thing to say. And so I'm really thankful for that. So thank you for your service to other adoptees in that way. I do really feel grateful. Trigger word about that.
And I'll say I'm very thankful, other trigger word, that that I'm able to be a resource and help our community in various ways. It's really been an honor to be on here. Thank you so much.
Thank you. I feel so deeply honored and grateful to be able to share stories like this with you. And I trust, as always, that you as a listener will be honoring and respectful to my guests and thank them for sharing their story and being vulnerable with us. It takes a lot of courage to share your story in such a public way. And so please make sure you thank our guests for how they are able to share with us so that we can feel seen and validated in our own experiences as well. It's a real honor to be able to hear these stories. And I couldn't share them without our Patreon supporters. So thank you so much for those of you who support the show monthly or yearly. It just is a huge deal to me, and I really appreciate it. If you want to join them, you can go to adopteeson.com/ adoptees.on/community. We would love to have you over there. Thank you so much for listening. Let's talk again soon.